Western countries have long been providing aid to poorer nations in the name of humanitarianism. But is the sole purpose of this to help the world's poor? Or is foreign aid a tool of a new kind of imperialism towards developing nations? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. I'm standing in front of Britain's aid agency, the Department of International Development. Well, while aid has been flowing from the developed countries to the developing nations, the poor remain poor. Is that because of the politics of foreign aid? Well, before we find out what the public thinks here on the streets of London, here's a short video clip.
The reasons why Western governments provide foreign aid are usually couched in humanitarian language. They say they give money in order to improve the lot of the world's poor. But the actual reasons behind foreign aid are usually rather different. 1/3 of all US aid goes to Israel and Egypt. Neither is a developing country, and the majority of the money is spent on arms. Israelis are also not poor, yet they receive $350 each from the US government. Total aid to Israel, including from private donors, is estimated to be over $20 billion a year. In contrast, Palestinians who live in Gaza receive no aid from Western governments due to an economic embargo. It was imposed because Hamas, which won elections in Palestinian territories, is listed as a terrorist organization in the West. The US government channels about half of its economic assistance through the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. One of its goals is to promote sustainable democracy. It says on its website that the United States is vigorously engaged in all corners of the globe, acting as a force of peace and prosperity. Yet, according to documents obtained by the Washington Post, US aid to Colombia was used to carry out spying operations and smear campaigns against political opponents, judges, and human rights activists. The aid, including arms and training, was given to units of the Colombian intelligence services over a 10-year period. Pakistan has also expressed concern that the CIA has intensified its spying operations in the country by using US aid as cover. About 70% of all US aid is spent on American goods and services. One of its purposes is to create foreign markets for US products, especially arms. Much of the aid is being directed towards nations that Britain considers strategically important, such as Pakistan and Afghanistan. Britain is to stop sending direct aid to Burundi and Niger, two of the world's poorest countries. The two African nations are ranked 2nd and 4th respectively in a World Bank list of the poorest states.
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking people what they thought the purpose of foreign aid really is.
Foreign aid is the purpose to make a lot of money for people that have already got a lot of money. And I can explain that quite simply. Government give foreign aid in order to have vast numbers of interest paid back. That is the purpose of foreign aid. They wouldn't do it otherwise.
Well, I think as a rich country, it's to support countries that are not so rich.
What do you think the purpose of foreign aid is?
Pump priming, basically. Enabling third world countries, I suppose, in a generic sense, to increasingly fend for themselves.
To help other countries who don't have the wherewithal to help themselves.
You would say that it's to benefit the countries it goes to, but very often it's actually to get rid of US farm subsidies, etc., etc.
What's the purpose of foreign aid?
Purpose of foreign aid would be, I'm assuming, to help the lives and the economy of foreign countries in the aim of helping ourselves.
To help the poor, to help supply food, to help tackle regimes, to help fight diseases, that kind of thing.
By supporting them, we make them want to be able to stay in their country, make their own economies stronger, be educated there, and therefore grow and become good trading partners with ourselves.
Why do you think governments give aid in particular rather than just charities? Why do governments give aid?
I don't know the answer, but I would assume there's something in return in the way of trade. That country may have minerals and oil, maybe, different natural minerals that they can sell back to the country, the government that gave the aid.
Well, then that's a very interesting question. I've never really thought about that. I suppose there's a little element of altruism there, but on the other hand, the ones who've got any sense work out how to make good commercial exploitation of the results of their aid.
I can't imagine countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and so forth would go to the kind of trouble they've gone to apparently stabilise a country like Afghanistan unless there was something in it for them. So there must be some kind of strategic interest.
Why do you think Western governments give aid to developing nations?
Probably in it with having the same principles that I have myself. They feel it important to share. They're not short. And what better than to give it to those less fortunate than ourselves?
Sometimes it may be tied into our own industries. We may be able to sell arms to them or sell other products to them. There may be some tie in there. Or even if it's not explicit, there may be some implicit connection.
Well, I suppose on one level it makes us feel good, doesn't it? I think it also contributes to, let's say, stability around the world. If you can help shift policy within countries into a more democratic way or a more fair way, you're likely to have less civil wars, you're likely to have less poverty within those countries, and then I suppose that contributes to a kind of global democratic, a global economic system as well that would come back and be good for us as well.
Well, that's what the public think. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
I think foreign aid has a number of purposes. I think primarily it's there to advance economic and human development, and this could be for economic purposes, it could be for ethical purposes, and it can be for political purposes, but there's also a political element to it, so it's a relation between countries, so obviously there is a political tie there, which means that political influence is certainly part of it. Some of the most successful areas have been in global health, so we've seen huge kind of drives of immunisation programs. We've seen, HIV/AIDS related deaths fall by 25% in the last 10-15 years. So I think global health, it's had a hugely positive impact. Developing civil society in a lot of countries has been a positive kind of aspect of foreign aid for sure. In terms of seeing the poorest countries, let's say, develop or become stable, there's an ethical benefit. I mean, if there is a view amongst the citizens of these countries that people shouldn't be starving in the 21st century, then obviously there's the ethical element to it. But equally, there's the economic benefit. These countries where there is high levels of poverty. These are markets also that the UK and the US should be looking to invest in the future and be doing business with in the future. So by providing aid and by helping these countries economically, there's a long-term economic benefit for these countries themselves. We've also seen that when countries really start to fail, so when we look at Somalia, when we look at Afghanistan, we see the global security issues that arise from these. So these countries are seen as terrorist kind of havens. A lot of the world's drugs, illegal drugs, come from these regions. So there's also a general benefit. And finally, there's also the political kind of tie that the US and the UK will have with countries that they're giving aid to, which is inevitable. I mean, a gift of money, even if it isn't necessarily a gift, comes with political kind of ties that follow.
The United States has threatened on several occasions to cut aid to Palestine, and very few Western nations give any aid at all to Gaza. Yet neighbouring Israel, whose citizens are much, much richer, receives billions of dollars in aid from the United States and elsewhere. Why is that?
Well, it depends what sort of aid they're giving, doesn't it? And what purpose they're giving. I couldn't imagine the American government, I'm not talking about the American people, the American government giving in anything unless they've got a huge return for it. And I'd probably find that the Palestinian people will be better off without the aid.
Well, that might be more to do with the Jewish vote, so they say, although actually if you start analysing it, it's probably not quite as strong as that. But yeah, no, well iffy.
The United States has on several occasions threatened to withdraw aid from the Palestinians if they didn't follow policies that America agreed with. Is that fair?
I don't know enough about that problem, really.
I think that's very doubtful. I would be giving money to Palestine myself.
I guess in Palestine, I think it's is it Hamas are in control of the Gaza Strip, I think, and I suppose it's by cutting aid to them. I guess what the Americans are doing is they're showing in a sort of fairly direct way their displeasure. They don't like the idea of Hamas, running the Gaza Strip. They still perceive them to pose a threat to the Israelis, I guess. And I suppose in terms of the Israelis, I mean, the Americans have always been their biggest supporter, always, without a shadow of doubt. I mean, they've never backed away from providing the Israelis with support, and I suppose they never will. I mean, they'll always be there.
The United States has on several occasions threatened to withdraw aid to the Palestinians if they didn't do what the Americans wanted. I mean, is that fair?
Well, obviously not. I mean, I think there is a limit to which one can sort of place demands on a country that you're giving aid to. I think it is reasonable in certain situations to say, well, we can't give you aid, and if you do this, that, the other. But where you draw that sort of line, whether it's a moral line or a economic line, or I don't know how one can justify it.
Well, clearly because of the political situation with Israel and Palestine, and that's the Americans' point of view. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's their decision.
Then I think that's probably back to your politics and your regime change, and you fund who you want to fund, as many people probably do, or most countries probably do. Whether it's fair, it doesn't sound fair from what you've said in that brief summary.
Why do governments selectively give aid to some countries and not others?
Well, it is partly political. I mean, in the case of China giving aid to African countries, for instance, there's economic benefit for them, and they muscle in ahead of the West in doing so. And there must be those aspects to it, economic aspects to it.
It should be on the basis of we're the poorest now, but I suspect that there's a lot of political and commercial influence as well.
They need the interest paid on that aid to finance fat bankers.
Well, they're bound to think, I suppose, first of their own security, and for that reason they've supported some very dubious countries who are authoritarian and are rather horrible to their own people. And so there is a strong element where they want to support democracy. And I think that what they've done in the Middle East in terms of the Arab Rising, I haven't seen much evidence of them doing much, but you picked on America, but I mean we have done quite a bit, I think, in helping Libya, for example.
Well, we have allies and we have enemies, so I think it's only natural that you give money to those people who either support you or support your general worldview, and you wouldn't give money to people who are actively trying to undermine your society or just don't agree with you.
Different views there from the public on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts think.
I mean, I think the Middle East in general has been one of the areas where aid has remained quite politicised. Throughout the Cold War, we saw the kind of very politicised nature of aid being given to allies. I think in the Middle East, if we look at who receives most aid, in general, Egypt has featured high on the list, Israel has featured high on the list, Tunisia, Turkey. So I think US aid can be used in a very strategic kind of geopolitical manner, but I think it's a shame that is the way aid is being used, but I think it's almost inevitable given the kind of global politics involved. I think a lot of the aid that does go to Israel probably is used more for military and defence spending given the situation in the region, so I wouldn't know exactly how the aid is being used, but I know a lot of it is used in terms of military aid and ensuring that Israel has a strong security and military kind of system. So again, it's questionable as to whether aid should be used for those kinds of purposes, but It's historically been the case in many countries, and particularly with close allies. In 2005 we had a big Paris meeting of donors to see how aid effectiveness could be improved. This was followed by meetings in Accra and more recently in Busan in South Korea. And the stuff that's come up is there needs to be more stable provision of aid. So developing countries need to know how much aid they'll receive long term, so they can actually plan and invest, knowing that they'll be receiving money for a few years to come at least. Greater harmonisation would be something that's also been on the agenda. So previously you've had governments like the Ethiopian government having to deal with 50 different donors and having to meet with all of them and try to match all of their plans. So there's been a push towards greater harmonisation, so donors working together in the interests of the developing country. I think greater ownership, particularly from responsible kind of governments that have shown that they are leading the way in terms of development. A lot of these governments are in sub-Saharan Africa, so I think these governments should also have greater ownership of development projects, so aid being provided to meet their aims and their targets rather than the donor kind of interests that tend to have dominated. So they're particularly the way, but equally I think the conditionalities placed on aid need to move away from kind of ideological economic concerns towards rights-based and needs-based concerns. So I think there are some of the areas, and I think there's been a lot of push to move aid in that direction in the last few years, and I think with the financial crisis there's been obviously a drop in the amount of aid given, so this could kind of put a halt to those kind of plans and those efforts, but I think that's effectively where we need to go in terms of to make aid more effective.
So do people agree that governments use foreign aid as a political tool? And also, what should be done to make sure that aid goes to the people who really need it? Well, let's find out what the public thinks.
No, I don't think very much. I think that the so-called NGOs, they work with a good spirit generally. They try to, but I think that fighting against the fantastic degrees of corruption is a very tough job, and I think they may well give up very rapidly.
I don't think you can escape any sort of political agenda. But again, I like to think that that's not the driving cause. I like to think that it's humanitarian causes that drive aid.
Do you agree that governments can use aid as a tool of foreign policy? In other words, only give aid to people as long as they do what they say?
Absolutely. It's a form of a weapon, isn't it? You do as we say and we will do as we like, sort of thing. If we look after you, we want something back. It's just friendship or whatever. It's something within the political world.
I certainly think there's a humanitarian aspect to foreign aid. I can't imagine that all foreign governments engage in foreign aid simply to simply as a political tool. I suppose in countries like, I guess, Somalia, where foreign aid is being supplied, but there's a suggestion that militant groups are simply taking the foreign aid and using it as a tool for controlling the population. They're starving the population or whatever, and there's an element of to and fro about it. But there is very, very clearly, I suppose, an element of political control.
Yes, of course. Unfortunately.
Do you think that foreign aid is a tool of governments in order?
Definitely. Like any economic element, it's all part and parcel of the economy in the modern world. You give to receive. Nobody's giving just out of the kindness of their own heart. It's a rational selfishness. You give because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the right thing to do. It's going to help you as well as helping them.
Absolutely. Political motivation is the absolute core of aid. You might want to dress it up with ethics, morality, but actually when it comes down to it, I scratch your back, hopefully you'll scratch mine a little bit more.
I think in practice it is, whether that's a good thing or not. I don't think you can escape the fact that, it is either explicitly or implicitly, it is part of the political dialogue you have with other countries.
What do you think can be done to make aid more effective?
I think it has to go through NGOs and not go directly to governments of, in many cases, questionable countries.
That's a really tough one. That's a really difficult answer. Being able to account for the aid that's provided requires some sort of measurement, and that's a very subjective term, and I think that's a really difficult thing to measure in a humanitarian context.
To be absolutely brutally honest, I would think an awful lot less foreign aid would ultimately do a lot of good, because I think sadly in some areas you're undermining local economies by flooding them with goods, services, etc., which really they should be able to do themselves. So I think less is more, personally.
Well, by choosing the right people and educating them properly in what their mission's going to be, and keep clear of corrupt governments.
What do you think can be done to make aid go to the people who need it better?
If it's given in goods rather than given in money. I don't, because once the money gets to any country, it doesn't have to be a particular country, it can disappear in overheads, for instance, not just buying for the poor people.
Well, it's very difficult to say, because every country has its own interests. So when you're supporting people that you will hope will have a friendly reaction to you. But we only have to look all around the world to see that we spend a great deal of money exporting weapons and dropping them on people, and we could actually probably be doing better by giving them food or allowing them to support themselves in having food.
There's always talk about conditions, aren't there, to give foreign aid on conditions, but then you're kind of denying the point. You're not helping the people who you're trying to, in theory, help. I guess maybe general discussion about it a little bit more, looking at things less in a black and white kind of way, and understanding that these are maybe more complex issues than we might otherwise think.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, we'll see each other next week. Bye-bye.